Let's get started. Story number 1.
I had never been a fan of nightlife. Bars, loud music, dim lighting, they weren't my thing. I preferred quiet evenings and low-key settings, but when I found myself moving to a new city in 2010, I had to adjust. The job was good, but loneliness crept in fast. One Thursday evening, after a particularly long week, I decided to try something different. I passed by a dimly lit bar on my way home from work, one that seemed to stand out against the city's otherwise modern architecture. It wasn't big, nor was it well maintained. There was something about it that made me stop. The sign above the door read, "The Glass Lantern," its neon flickering intermittently, casting a faint glow onto the cracked sidewalk. The door creaked open as I pushed it, and the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke hit me immediately. The inside was much like I'd expected. Old, dark wood paneling on the walls, dusty shelves lined with bottles, and a jukebox playing a quiet, mournful tune in the corner. A few regulars sat at the bar, nursing drinks and talking quietly. But the most striking thing about the bar, even more than the atmosphere, was the woman. She was a dancer. Every Thursday night, around 9 p.m., she took to the small stage in the corner of the bar. I'd never seen her perform before, and that evening I was unsure of what to expect. At first I thought she was just another part of the scenery, a regular bar entertainer, but I quickly realized I had made a mistake. She was striking, mesmerizing even. She had long dark hair that cascaded around her shoulders like silk, and her movements were fluid, like she was in a trance. There was something eerie about the way she moved, something that didn't quite belong in the dingy, mundane surroundings of the Glass Lantern. She didn't look like the kind of woman who belonged in a place like that. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, large and dark, seemed to look right through you. She danced with a kind of grace that made it impossible to look away, and yet, as I stared at her, an odd sensation of dread settled in my chest. There was something unsettling in her performance, an unspoken tension that ran through her every movement. The music was slow, haunting, and it matched the atmosphere she created perfectly. I wasn't the only one who noticed her. The other patrons, a mix of middle-aged men and a few women, sat with their drinks in hand, fixated on her. But it wasn't just the attention they gave her, it was the way they looked at her, almost worshipfully. It was as though they were mesmerized, as though they were under some kind of spell. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but it lingered. After her performance, she disappeared behind the curtain that separated the stage from the rest of the bar. The crowd went back to their quiet conversations, but I couldn't seem to focus. Something about her seemed off, and it made me uncomfortable. Over the next few weeks, I found myself returning to the Glass Lantern every Thursday night. Each time she performed. Each time her presence became more and more unsettling. I couldn't quite explain it, but every time she danced, the temperature in the bar seemed to drop, the air thick with tension. People grew quieter as she danced, their eyes wide with fascination. It felt like everyone was in a trance. One night, after her performance, I decided to follow her. I don't know why. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe it was that gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. As soon as she finished dancing, I got up from my seat and walked toward the back door where I had seen her slip behind. I tried to remain inconspicuous, hoping no one would notice, but I could feel the eyes of the bar on me. I reached the door just as it closed behind her, and I pushed it open softly. The back room was dimly lit, almost entirely dark except for a small overhead light in the far corner. The walls were lined with old mirrors, their edges chipped and scratched. The smell of old dust and perfume lingered in the air. She was standing in front of one of the mirrors, her back to me. She was staring at her reflection, and for a moment I thought she hadn't noticed me. "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping forward, my voice soft but unsure. She didn't respond at first, but then, very slowly, she turned to face me. Her eyes were black, no whites at all, just a void, an endless darkness that made my stomach tighten. For a moment I was frozen, unable to look away, but then I managed to break the trance. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, they were back to normal. Her eyes were still dark, but they seemed sad. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice soft but filled with something unsettling. It was like a warning, but also a plea. I was about to say something, but before I could, the door to the room slammed shut behind me, and the air turned frigid. I could see my breath in the cold, even though the heat from the bar had been stifling just moments before. The mirrors on the walls seemed to distort as if they were warping, pulling the light into themselves. The woman stepped toward me, her movements slow but deliberate. I felt a strange pull toward her, as though I was being drawn into her gaze. She came closer until she was just a few inches away, and then, in the cold silence, she whispered, "You shouldn't have come." Her breath was cold, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to speak, but my throat was tight, my words caught in my chest. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of the scene, but I couldn't. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. I'm sorry, I finally managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. Her lips twisted into a faint, almost sad smile, and I saw something flash in her eyes, an emotion I couldn't quite name. But then, just as quickly, she turned and walked toward the mirror. Her reflection, however, didn't follow her. It stayed in place, frozen in time. I watched, horrified, as she disappeared into the reflection. Her form melted into the glass as though she was absorbed by it, leaving only a blank surface behind. I stood there, rooted to the spot, unsure of what to do or how to escape. The cold in the room deepened, and the mirrors seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. And then, as if someone had flipped a switch, the door to the back room opened, and I stumbled out into the bar. The patrons hadn't noticed anything strange. They sat at their tables, sipping their drinks as though nothing had happened. The jukebox continued playing softly in the corner. I didn't speak to anyone that night. I couldn't. I just paid my tab and left as quickly as I could, the strange scene replaying in my head over and over. I never returned to the glass lantern after that night. I couldn't bring myself to go back, and slowly the memory of the bar faded from my mind. But every now and then, I would hear whispers from the city's forgotten corners, tales of a woman, a dancer, who haunted the bar. Some said she had been a performer, a beautiful woman who had died tragically many years ago. Others said she was something far darker, an entity that had somehow found a way to remain tied to the bar, to the dance. But one thing remained constant. Anyone who saw her dance would never forget her, and those who tried to follow her would never escape. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
It was the summer of 1998, and Kabir was a struggling filmmaker in Mumbai, desperate for inspiration and a story that would catapult him into the limelight. Nights in the city were his playground, and it was during one of these nights that he stumbled upon a small, seedy bar called Chandni Mahal. The place wasn't anything remarkable, a dimly lit, smoky dive frequented by men drowning their sorrows in cheap whiskey. But the rumor he heard that evening was what caught his attention. "They say the best dancer here is cursed," a man at the bar slurred, leaning close to Kabir. "Beautiful as an angel, but haunted." Kabir's curiosity was piqued. He had always been drawn to the supernatural, and if there was even a shred of truth to the story, it could be the creative spark he needed. He asked the bartender about the dancer. "That would be Sana," the bartender said hesitantly. "She's mesmerizing, but there's something about her. Been working here for years, and people say strange things happen around her. Lights flicker, people feel cold drafts in the middle of summer, and some say she doesn't age." Intrigued, Kabir ordered another drink and decided to wait for Sana's performance. When she finally took the stage, the room fell silent. She was stunning, her eyes lined with kohl, her movements graceful and hypnotic. She wore a crimson lehenga that shimmered in the dim light, and when she began to dance, it was as if time itself had stopped. Kabir couldn't look away. Her expressions, her fluidity, and the sorrow in her eyes, it was hauntingly beautiful. But there was something unsettling too, like an invisible weight hung in the air. After her performance, Kabir asked the bartender if he could speak to her. The man shook his head. "She doesn't talk to anyone, comes and goes like a ghost." Determined, Kabir decided to linger outside the bar to see if he could catch her leaving. The hours dragged on, and one by one, the patrons and staff trickled out, but there was no sign of Sana. Confused, Kabir eventually went home, his mind spinning with possibilities. Over the next few nights, Kabir returned to the bar, watching Sana's performances and piecing together bits of information from the regulars. The story that emerged was chilling. Sana had been dancing at Chandni Mahal for over a decade, yet she looked as though she was still in her 20s. No one knew where she lived, and she was never seen outside the bar. Some said she was the spirit of a dancer named Mira, who had died tragically in the 1980s. The details varied, but one story stuck with Kabir. According to an old patron, Mira had been the bar's star dancer. She had fallen in love with a wealthy patron who had promised to marry her, but when he betrayed her for another woman, Mira had taken her own life in the bar's dressing room. Her body had been discovered the next morning, slumped against the mirror, a bottle of poison in her hand. Since then, strange occurrences had plagued the bar, and shortly after her death, Sana had appeared. Kabir knew he had to dig deeper. He visited the municipal archives, scouring old newspapers for any mention of Mira. His search led him to a small, faded article from 1985. It confirmed the story. A dancer named Mira had indeed died under mysterious circumstances at Chandni Mahal. The article mentioned whispers of foul play, but the case had been closed as a suicide. Armed with this knowledge, Kabir decided to confront Sana. One night, after her performance, he slipped into the backstage area of the bar. The dressing room was eerily quiet, the air heavy with the scent of stale flowers and makeup. A cracked mirror hung on the wall, and Kabir's eyes were immediately drawn to it. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow move across the glass, but when he blinked, it was gone. Suddenly, he heard soft footsteps. He turned, and there she was, Sana, standing in the doorway, her crimson lehenga glowing faintly in the dim light. Her eyes locked onto his, and Kabir felt a chill run down his spine. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly, her voice like a whisper carried by the wind. "I just want to talk," Kabir said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I know about Mira." At the mention of the name, Sana's expression darkened. She stepped closer, and Kabir instinctively backed away. "Leave her alone," she said, her tone sharp now. "She's suffered enough." Kabir hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. "Who are you?" he asked. "Are you Mira?" Sana didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked toward the mirror. As she did, the temperature in the room dropped, and Kabir could see his breath fogging in the air. When she reached the mirror, she placed a hand on the cracked glass and whispered something Kabir couldn't hear. And then, to his horror, her reflection in the mirror began to change. It wasn't Sana anymore, it was someone else. A woman with tear-streaked cheeks, her eyes filled with anguish. The reflection reached out, pressing its hand against the glass as if trying to break through. Kabir stumbled back, his heart pounding. "What is this?" he stammered. Sana turned to him, her eyes filled with sorrow. "It's her prison," she said. "She can't leave. She's bound to this place, to this mirror, and now so am I." Before Kabir could respond, the lights flickered, and a loud crash echoed through the room. The mirror shattered, sending shards of glass flying. When Kabir looked up, Sana was gone. The room was empty, save for the broken mirror and the eerie silence that followed. Kabir ran out of the bar and didn't look back. He never returned to Chandni Mahal, and within a year, the bar was shut down. Locals said it had been cursed from the start. Years later, Kabir turned the story into a film. It was a modest success, but he never revealed that it was based on his own experience. Even now, he avoids mirrors at night, afraid of what he might see. And sometimes when he's alone, he swears he hears the faint sound of bangles jingling and the mournful hum of a dancer's song echoing through the darkness.
Story number 3.
In 2005, Rahul, a 28-year-old journalist working for a Mumbai tabloid, was assigned to cover a story about a bar in the city's suburbs that had gained infamy for its late-night performances. Known simply as Noor Mahal, the establishment was popular for its bar dancers who lured wealthy patrons with their beauty and captivating moves. The bar had a shadowy reputation, not just for its illicit dealings, but for the rumors of something far darker. Locals whispered about a dancer who had died mysteriously years ago, and whose presence still lingered. Rahul didn't believe in ghosts or superstitions, but he was intrigued by the rumors. If there was one thing he knew, it was that a juicy paranormal angle would sell papers. So one humid July evening, he found himself outside Noor Mahal. The air smelled of rain-soaked asphalt, mixed with the faint scent of incense wafting from a nearby temple. As he entered, the dim lighting and cigarette smoke gave the place an otherworldly feel. The bar was packed with men in crumpled suits and gold chains, throwing wads of cash at the dancers who swayed to a melancholic Bollywood tune. Rahul spotted the manager, a stout man named Malik, leaning against the bar counter. After introducing himself, Rahul asked if he could observe for a few nights, under the guise of writing a story about the culture of Mumbai's nightlife. Malik hesitated, but eventually agreed. "Just don't ask too many questions," he muttered, his eyes darting around the room nervously. Rahul took a seat in the corner, nursing a whiskey he didn't really want. The dancers moved gracefully on the stage, their sequined saris catching the dim light. One by one, they performed, each act blending into the next. But then, the final performer of the night took the stage, and the atmosphere changed. She wore a deep red sari, her long black hair cascading down her back. There was something ethereal about her, something almost hypnotic. Her eyes seemed to glimmer in the low light, locking onto the audience as if she could see straight into their souls. The room fell unusually quiet as she began to move, her dance slow and deliberate. "That's Arzu," a waiter whispered to Rahul as he cleared the table nearby. "She's our star performer, but..." He hesitated, his voice dropping. "She's the one people talk about, the one who..." He trailed off, his face pale. Rahul pressed for more information, but the waiter hurried away, leaving Rahul to watch Arzu finish her performance. When she was done, the room erupted into applause, but Rahul couldn't shake a strange feeling. It wasn't admiration or attraction, it was unease, a coldness that crept up his spine. After the bar closed, Rahul stayed back, convincing Malik to let him interview a few of the staff. Most of them dismissed the ghost stories as drunken gossip, but one older bartender, Shyam, leaned in close and lowered his voice. "There's truth to it," he said. "Arzu, she's not like the others. Years ago, a dancer named Ruksar worked here. She was the most beautiful, the most talented. Men would line up just to see her. But one night, a jealous patron, someone powerful, killed her in a fit of rage. Her body was found in the alley behind the bar. Ever since then, strange things have happened. And then Arzu showed up." Rahul frowned. "What do you mean?" Shyam's hands trembled as he wiped a glass. "Arzu appeared out of nowhere one night, asking for work. She doesn't seem to age, and she always performs last. The strange thing is, no one ever sees her leave, and sometimes, late at night, you can hear someone crying in the dressing room. But when you go to check, it's empty." Rahul wasn't convinced. He chalked it up to superstition and embellished rumors, but he decided to stay another night to see if he could uncover more. The next evening, Rahul arrived early and positioned himself near the stage. When Arzu's turn came, he watched her intently, trying to spot something, anything, that might explain the rumors. But she danced flawlessly, her movements fluid and hauntingly beautiful. After her performance, Rahul waited outside the bar, hoping to catch her leaving. Hours passed and patrons began to trickle out. The dancers left in small groups, chatting and laughing, but Arzu never appeared. Determined, Rahul snuck around to the back of the building where the dressing rooms were located. The alley was dark, the faint glow of a street lamp barely piercing the gloom. He pressed his ear to the dressing room door and listened. At first, there was silence. But then, faintly, he heard it. A soft, heart-wrenching sob. Rahul's heart pounded as he pushed the door open. The room was empty, the dim light flickering overhead. Costumes hung limply on racks, and the smell of stale makeup filled the air. But the crying continued, growing louder. It was coming from the far corner of the room where a large, cracked mirror stood. He approached slowly, his breath catching in his throat. As he stared into the mirror, his reflection blurred. And then he saw her. Arzu, or was it Ruksar, standing behind him, her eyes filled with sorrow. Her lips moved, whispering words he couldn't hear. He spun around, but the room was empty. When he turned back to the mirror, her reflection was gone. Rahul stumbled out of the bar, his mind racing. He didn't return the next night or the night after that, but he couldn't let it go. He began digging into the bar's history, searching old newspaper archives and police reports. He found an article from 1997 about a dancer named Ruksar who had been murdered behind Noor Mahal. The case was never solved. Rahul returned to the bar one last time, hoping to confront Malik. But when he arrived, the bar was shuttered, a for sale sign hanging crookedly on the gate. Locals said the owner had left suddenly, without explanation. To this day, Rahul isn't sure what he saw in that mirror. But sometimes, late at night, when he's alone in his apartment, he swears he can hear faint music, soft and sorrowful like the echoes of a dance that never truly ended.
Story number 4.
I had always heard the rumors about the old bar on 5th and Main. The Last Call, they called it, a small, rundown place that had been in the city for decades. Not much to look at from the outside, just a faded neon sign and a couple of bar stools in the window. I had passed it countless times over the years, but I never thought much about it. Bars weren't really my scene. I preferred quiet nights in, reading a book or watching old movies. But that all changed one Thursday evening in 2012. It was one of those long, exhausting weeks, and I needed something different, something to shake off the stress. I had just moved into a new apartment across town, and I hadn't made many friends yet. I decided to stop by The Last Call for a drink after work, just to see what it was like. There was no particular reason for choosing that bar over others, except that it was close, and I didn't feel like walking far. When I entered, the dim lighting and the quiet hum of conversation felt oddly comforting. The bar was empty save for a couple of regulars sitting at the far end with their drinks. The bartender, an older man with a gruff voice, gave me a nod as I made my way to a seat. I ordered a beer, took a sip, and surveyed the place. There was nothing remarkable about it. The walls were decorated with old pictures, the floor was scuffed and worn, and the air smelled faintly of stale beer and cigarette smoke. Yet, as I sat there, a strange feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. It was as if I was being watched, though when I glanced around, no one seemed to be paying me any attention. Then, just as I was about to ask the bartender about the local scene, the lights dimmed further, and the jukebox in the corner crackled to life. A slow, eerie tune began to play, and I noticed the regulars looking up toward the stage at the back of the bar. At first, I didn't see anything. It was dark, and the stage was barely lit, but as the music picked up, I saw her. A woman emerged from the shadows, stepping onto the small stage in the corner. She was tall, her long hair cascading in dark waves over her shoulders. She wore a simple black dress that clung to her figure, but it was the way she moved that immediately caught my attention. Her every step was fluid, almost hypnotic. She didn't speak or acknowledge the few patrons in the bar. She simply began to dance. Her movements were graceful, yet there was something unsettling about them. They were too perfect, too practiced. She moved like someone who had danced for centuries, as if the motions had been ingrained in her body long ago, like an ancient ritual. The music flowed with her, a soft melody that matched the melancholy in the air. I couldn't take my eyes off her. She was beautiful, but in a way that made my heart race with unease. It was as if she wasn't just dancing for attention, she was dancing for something else, something I couldn't quite understand. Her eyes, dark and deep, never once glanced in my direction, but it felt as though she was aware of me, aware of everyone in the room. There was a strange stillness that hung in the air, and I felt as if time had stopped. I wasn't the only one watching. The few regulars in the bar had fallen silent, their eyes glued to her, their faces expressionless. It was as if they were in a trance, all of them sitting motionless, lost in her performance. The longer I watched her, the more I felt like I wasn't really there, like I was a part of some dream that didn't belong to me. The dance seemed to go on forever. It wasn't a long routine, but time seemed to stretch unnaturally, and I found myself wondering how much longer I could sit there without feeling like I was losing my grip on reality. Finally, the music slowed to a stop, and the woman stopped dancing mid-step, her arms frozen in the air. There was a long, unnerving silence, and then, without a word, she turned and disappeared behind the curtain at the back of the stage. The regulars slowly returned to their drinks, as if nothing had happened. The bartender resumed wiping down the counter, and the jukebox clicked back to its idle hum. The air felt heavier somehow, as if something had shifted, but no one seemed to notice. I sat in stunned silence for a few moments before deciding to finish my drink and leave. But as I stood to go, I noticed something strange. The bartender was watching me. His eyes were narrow, almost suspicious. "You new around here?" he asked gruffly. I nodded. "Just moved in. I heard this place was decent." He gave a small grunt. "It's fine, just don't get too comfortable. Some things about this place aren't for everyone." I raised an eyebrow, curious. What do you mean? He hesitated for a moment before lowering his voice. The dancer, Evelyn, she's been here for years. Some say she's not really alive anymore. I frowned, unsure if he was serious. What do you mean by that? The bartender looked around as if checking to see if anyone was listening. People who stay too long, people who get too curious start seeing things. Her dancing. It's not just for show. There's something wrong about it. Before I could ask more, he quickly turned away and started preparing a drink for another customer, ending the conversation abruptly. I left the bar that night with a strange unease lingering in my chest. The images of Evelyn, the dancer, kept replaying in my mind. The way she moved, her eyes, the unnatural stillness in the room as she danced. It all felt wrong, like I had witnessed something that wasn't meant to be seen. Over the next few weeks, I found myself returning to the last call, always on Thursday nights when Evelyn performed. I couldn't explain it, but I was drawn to the place, to her. Every time it felt like something was off, like the air was thicker, colder, and that something unseen was watching. The bar became a place of strange energy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't welcome there. I spoke to a few of the regulars, trying to gather more information, but no one seemed willing to talk. Everyone was polite but distant, like they were all hiding something. Then one night I overheard something chilling. Two older men were sitting at the bar, talking quietly. "Have you heard? Another one went missing." The other man nodded. "Yeah, same as the others. They all leave after seeing her. Some just disappear. No one really talks about it, but it's been going on for years." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "What do you mean? People just disappear?" One of the men turned to look at me, his eyes wary. "You don't want to know. Just stay away from Evelyn. Don't get too close." But it was too late. The pull I felt toward the dancer was too strong. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The next Thursday, I waited until after her performance. This time, I was determined to speak with her, to figure out what was going on. As the crowd dispersed, I approached the back curtain where she disappeared every week. I hesitated for a moment, but the curiosity won out. I pushed the curtain aside. What I saw chilled me to my core. The room behind the stage was empty, except for a single chair. But it wasn't the emptiness that terrified me. It was the mirror on the far wall. The reflection in the mirror didn't match the room. The chair, the walls, even the floor, it was all different, older, more decayed. But it was the figure in the reflection that made my heart stop. Evelyn stood there, but she wasn't dancing. She was staring at her own reflection, her face twisted in anguish, her eyes empty, like she was staring into a void. I stepped back, but the room seemed to close in on me. The air was suffocating, thick with an unnatural cold. I turned and ran out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I never went back to the last call after that night. I couldn't bring myself to. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces fell into place. Evelyn wasn't just a dancer, she was something else, something that had been trapped in that bar for years, feeding off the people who came to watch her. I don't know if she was a ghost or something darker, but I knew one thing for sure. Some performances are best left unseen. Story. The end.
Story number 5.
I had never been much of a bar goer. The loud music, the smell of alcohol, and the clinking of glasses weren't exactly my idea of a relaxing evening. But there I was, one cold evening in 2015, at a bar on the edge of town. The kind of place you wouldn't think twice about unless you were looking for it. It was called The Lantern's Glow, and it had been around for as long as I could remember. From the outside, it didn't look like much, an old, dimly lit building with a flickering neon sign above the door, barely visible under the weight of time. But there was something about that night. Maybe it was the way the city seemed quieter than usual, or how the streets were empty, despite the usual bustle. Something pulled me in. I pushed the door open, and the immediate change in temperature hit me like a wall. It was warmer inside, but stale, like the air had been trapped in here for decades. The faint smell of smoke, liquor, and something older I couldn't quite place lingered in the air. The bar was practically deserted, just a few people scattered around, sitting at tables, quietly chatting or staring into their drinks. The atmosphere was thick, and the dim lights made it feel like I had stepped into another era. The bartender, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a tired expression, didn't acknowledge me at first. I sat down at the bar, and after a few moments he poured me a beer. The silence between us, comfortable but unsettling. The jukebox in the corner played some forgotten tune from the 80s, adding to the strange ambiance. As I took a sip of my drink, I noticed a stage at the far end of the room, obscured in shadows. A small, modest space with a single spotlight above it. It looked like the kind of place where they'd host karaoke nights, or perhaps a live band now and then. But tonight, there was no band, no microphones or instruments. Instead, a woman stepped onto the stage. She was tall, with long, dark hair that fell around her shoulders in loose waves. She was dressed in a simple black dress, not flashy, but it hung in a way that seemed deliberate, like she had a presence that couldn't be ignored. I glanced around, noticing the sudden change in the energy of the room. The few people who had been murmuring to each other fell silent, their attention completely fixed on her. It was as if they'd all been waiting for her to arrive. She didn't say a word, but she began to move. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost hypnotic. She swayed to the music, her body flowing with the rhythm, but it wasn't the kind of dancing that felt joyful. There was something haunting about it, like she was lost in the music, or worse, like the music was controlling her. Her eyes, dark and unblinking, scanned the room, but not in a way that made you feel like she was looking at you. It felt like she was looking through you, past you, as if you didn't exist. I couldn't help but watch, transfixed by her. The longer I looked, the more unsettled I became. It was as if the air in the room had thickened, like the temperature had dropped without me noticing. The regulars at the bar were frozen, not even blinking, their gazes locked on her. Even the bartender had stopped moving, his hand resting on the counter, staring at the woman on stage. No one spoke, no one moved. I finished my beer in a hurry, feeling an uncomfortable pressure building in my chest. There was something deeply unsettling about her performance, something I couldn't put my finger on. She danced as though the music was pulling her along, each movement more graceful and haunting than the last. But it wasn't just the dancing, it was the atmosphere, the stillness, the complete lack of life in the room, except for her. And the more I watched, the more I felt like I was losing myself in the trance she had cast over everyone. Eventually, she stopped mid-motion as if the music had suddenly stopped playing. The room stayed still, and for a moment I thought the silence was going to stretch on forever. And then she simply turned and walked off the stage, disappearing behind a curtain. The regulars blinked as if waking from a dream, and the air seemed to shift again. The bartender started moving, refilling drinks, and the conversations resumed like nothing had happened. The jukebox clicked and switched to another song, and everything returned to normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Something had changed in the room, something had shifted, and I wasn't sure what. I couldn't explain it, but I felt wrong, like I had just witnessed something that wasn't meant to be seen. Curiosity got the best of me, and I stayed for another drink. The woman, who I had learned was named Isla, didn't reappear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, lingering somewhere in the shadows. I asked the bartender about her, trying to seem casual, but he gave me a strange look before responding. She's been performing here for years. Used to be more often, but things changed. Some say she's a bit of a ghost, he said, his voice low, as if he didn't want to be overheard. A ghost? The bartender glanced around before lowering his voice even further. Some nights, people don't come back after they've seen her dance. You'll see them leave, but they won't come back. Not ever. I raised an eyebrow, unsure if he was serious or just trying to mess with me. What do you mean? He shrugged. I don't know. You'll see, if you keep coming back. I didn't know what to make of it. It was the kind of thing that you'd expect to hear in a small town bar, but there was something about the way he said it that made my skin crawl. As I finished my drink and prepared to leave, I felt that same strange tug in my chest, an unease that wouldn't let me go. I had seen enough, but I knew, deep down, I wasn't done. Not yet. Something was pulling me to return. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about Isla. I didn't return immediately, but eventually on a quiet Tuesday night, I found myself walking back into the lantern's glow. It was late, and there were only a few people inside, but as I walked in, I felt that same eerie sensation in the air. And there, once again, on the small stage, was Isla. This time, there was no one else in the bar except for me and the bartender. Isla moved differently this time, slower, almost more deliberate. And as I watched her, something inside me clicked. I realized that I had seen her before, not just on the stage, but in the mirrors, in the windows, in the reflections of the bar's old fixtures. She had been there, following me, her image flickering at the edges of my vision. I had seen her in the shadows behind the bar, in the dark corners of the room. I don't know how I hadn't noticed before, but now I couldn't look away. Every movement she made was like a spell, pulling me deeper, making me feel like I was slipping away from myself. I tried to leave, to get up, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move. The bartender wasn't even paying attention. He was staring at her too, as if hypnotized. And then, as suddenly as she had started, the music stopped. She didn't pause, didn't wait for the end of the song. She simply stopped moving, as though frozen in time. I felt the room grow colder. My breath came out in small clouds, and I realized that the air had gone still again, heavier than before. Isla turned toward me, and this time she looked directly at me. Her eyes, dark and empty, like deep pools of nothing, stared into mine. She didn't speak, but I could feel her presence like a weight pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. "Leave," she whispered, the sound barely audible over the silence. I snapped out of my trance, my legs finally working again. I bolted for the door, the coldness of the air biting at my skin. I didn't stop until I was out on the street, the lights of the bar flickering behind me. I never went back to the lantern's glow. I don't know what happened to Isla, but I suspect she was more than just a dancer, more than just a ghost, and some things are better left unexplored. Story the end.
Story number 6.
In the small, forgotten town of Golden Hill, there was a bar tucked between two old, crumbling buildings, known only to locals. It had the kind of faded neon sign that flickered when the wind was strong, and its windows were perpetually covered with grime, the kind of place people didn't speak of unless they had to. The bar was called the Ghost Light, and its most famous attraction was the bar dancer, a woman named Veronica. She wasn't just any dancer. She had an ethereal quality, one that was haunting, both in her beauty and her movements. When she performed, it was as if the room became a bit colder, the lights dimmed just slightly, and time itself seemed to stretch out. It was the early 1990s when I first heard about Veronica. I was a young man, new to the town, and struggling to adjust to my new life. My job at the factory was monotonous, and my social life was non-existent. One evening, feeling a bit lost, I wandered into the Ghost Light, unsure of what to expect. The bar was dimly lit, the air thick with smoke, and a few patrons sat hunched over their drinks, their eyes glazed over. A low murmur of voices, coupled with the soft shuffle of jukebox music, created an eerie atmosphere. At the far end of the room, a small stage was set up, lit by a single spotlight. Veronica was there, moving gracefully in her long, flowing dress that shimmered in the half-light. She danced as if the music flowed through her, her body swaying with an otherworldly elegance. Her face was pale, with sharp, haunting features. Long, dark hair framed her face, and her eyes, deep and black, seemed to draw you in, compelling you to watch. She never spoke, never acknowledged the crowd, yet she held their attention as if she were part of the room itself. At first, I thought it was the alcohol or my own loneliness, but there was something unsettling about her presence. The temperature in the room dropped as soon as she began, and the patrons became eerily still as if hypnotized by her every move. I found myself staring, unable to look away. Over the next few weeks, I made it a habit to visit the Ghost Light. Veronica's performances became a strange ritual. Every night she danced, but she never stayed for more than an hour and always left without a word. The same cold chill would settle in, and the music would echo long after she disappeared into the back of the bar. Then one evening, after another haunting performance, I decided to follow her. It was late, and the bar was nearly empty. Veronica had just finished her dance and was heading toward the back door. I couldn't resist. I slipped through the crowd, my curiosity getting the best of me. I followed her down a narrow hallway, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The hallway led to a small room at the back of the bar. I stood there for a moment, hesitating before gently pushing the door open. Inside, Veronica was standing in front of a cracked mirror, her back to me. The faint glow from the hallway illuminated her figure, casting strange shadows on the walls. I could hear her breathing, slow and steady, as if she hadn't noticed my presence. "Veronica," I called, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't turn. She didn't flinch. But somehow I felt her gaze on me. Her eyes were like two black holes pulling me in, and in that moment, I knew something wasn't right. Her skin seemed too pale, almost translucent. Her hair appeared too dark, and her movements were unnaturally still. I stepped closer, feeling a chill in the air that made my skin crawl. "Are you all right?" I asked, my voice trembling. She slowly turned around, her eyes locking onto mine. There was no warmth in her gaze, only an eerie emptiness that sent a shiver down my spine. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice soft but heavy with warning. Before I could respond, she vanished, as if she had been nothing but a shadow, slipping through the cracks of the room. I stood frozen, unsure of what had just happened. The room was empty, silent as though the moment had never occurred. I stumbled back into the bar, my heart racing. The patrons were still there, as if nothing had happened. The music continued to play, and the air was thick with cigarette smoke and alcohol. No one seemed to notice the coldness, the sudden chill that had settled over the room. In the following days, I couldn't shake the image of Veronica's hollow gaze. Something about her unsettled me, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't know anything about her. No one at the bar talked about her outside of her performances, and when I tried to ask the bartender about her, they'd always change the subject or offer some vague excuse. It was as if she wasn't meant to be questioned. But my obsession grew. I had to know more. One night, as I sat at the bar, I struck up a conversation with an older man who had been coming to the Ghostlight for years. He seemed to have lived through much of the town's history, and I hoped he knew something about Veronica. "She's been here a long time, hasn't she?" I asked casually, sipping my drink. The man gave me a strange look, as if weighing the question in his mind. He looked over at the stage where Veronica was once again dancing, her movements fluid and mesmerizing. "Veronica," he said slowly, "she's been here for as long as anyone can remember. No one knows where she came from or why she dances every night. Some say she's a ghost, a spirit trapped here, never able to move on." I felt a cold shiver run through me. "A ghost?" He nodded. "You see, before the Ghostlight was a bar, it was a dance hall, and before that it was a house that used to belong to a woman named Amelia. She was a dancer too, but she was in love with a man who never returned her affections. Heartbroken, she took her own life here. Some say she never left." I stared at the old man, trying to process his words. "Are you saying Veronica is Amelia?" The man didn't answer, but his gaze shifted toward the stage. Veronica was still dancing, her movements graceful yet haunting. The same pale face, the same empty eyes. It was as if time stood still and the room itself was holding its breath. I couldn't let it go. I began visiting the bar every night, growing more consumed with the mystery of Veronica. The chill that surrounded her grew stronger, and soon I started to notice strange things. Doors that were supposed to be locked were open. The mirror in the back room would fog up with no explanation, and sometimes I would hear faint whispers in the silence, like soft voices calling my name. Then one night, I stayed behind after the last performance. It was nearly closing time, and Veronica had just finished dancing. She walked toward the back room, as she always did, and I followed. This time, I didn't hesitate. I pushed the door open again and found myself in the same room. But this time, the air felt heavier, colder. The faint whispers from before seemed to be coming from all directions. I called her name, but there was no answer. Instead, the air grew thick with the scent of old perfume, and I saw the figure of a woman standing in the mirror. It wasn't Veronica. It was a different woman entirely, her face twisted in sorrow and rage. The mirror began to crack, and the woman in the reflection reached out toward me, her fingers outstretched. I stumbled back, panic setting in. The air grew colder, and I felt a force pulling me toward the mirror as if the woman was calling me. Suddenly, Veronica appeared behind me, but her eyes were no longer empty. They were filled with something darker, something ancient. She whispered again, the same warning, "You shouldn't be here." I didn't listen. I couldn't. But before I could take another step, everything went black. When I woke up, I was outside, lying on the cold ground behind the bar. The door to the Ghostlight was locked, and the bar was dark. The neon sign above the door was flickering, as if struggling to stay lit. I never saw Veronica again. Years passed, and the ghost light eventually closed down, its windows boarded up, its neon sign fading into obscurity. The town moved on, but the whispers about the bar dancer never stopped. People still talked about her, but no one knew what really happened to her. All I know is this. I never went back to the ghost light, and I never wanted to know what happened to Veronica. But every now and then, when the wind blows cold on a quiet night, I can almost hear the faint sound of music drifting on the breeze, followed by the sound of footsteps, soft and graceful in the dark. And sometimes I swear I can still see her face, pale and haunting, in the reflection of a cracked mirror. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was late autumn, around 2003, when I first set foot in the old bar on Elm Street. It was one of those places you'd never notice unless you were looking for it. Tucked away in a corner of the city's oldest district, sandwiched between a rundown convenience store and a crumbling building that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The sign, which was barely illuminated, read, "The Last Dance." I had just moved to the city for work, like far away from my family and everything I knew. I hadn't made many friends yet, so one evening, after a long day at the office, I decided to check out a bar to unwind. Something about the dim glow of the neon sign caught my eye as I walked home from the subway. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy with a mix of cigarette smoke and stale beer. The room was small but cozy, with dark wood paneling and a scattering of mismatched tables. It wasn't busy, just a few regulars hunched over their drinks in the dim corners, but the energy was strangely calming. There was a sense of quiet intimacy in the air. At the far end of the room, there was a small stage where an old jukebox played softly in the background. I took a seat at the bar, ordered a beer, and let the weight of the day fall off my shoulders. I didn't plan on staying long, but something about the place kept me there. That was when I first saw her. She was standing at the edge of the stage, her long, dark hair cascading over her shoulders like a river of midnight. She was tall, with a graceful, almost otherworldly presence. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, with sharp features and dark eyes that seemed to pierce through you. Her lips curled into a small smile as she stepped into the spotlight, and I could feel the entire room's attention shift toward her. Without a word, she began to dance. Her movements were fluid, mesmerizing, as though she were floating rather than walking. The way her body swayed with the rhythm of the music was hypnotic, and I found myself unable to look away. She was the only thing in the room that mattered, and for the next few minutes, the bar seemed to fade into the background. I wasn't the only one transfixed by her performance. The few patrons who were there sat up straighter, their eyes fixed on her, as though they too couldn't break free from her spell. The room felt colder, but no one seemed to notice. The music echoed softly, and she danced, undeterred, as if she had been doing this for an eternity. As the song ended, she stopped, gave a small nod to the audience, and walked off the stage, disappearing behind a door at the back of the bar. The room slowly returned to its previous state of quiet murmurings and low conversations, but I could still feel the faint echo of her presence in the air. Curiosity gnawed at me, and I knew I had to know more about the woman who had captivated the entire bar. I finished my drink, then made my way over to the bartender, an older man with a thick mustache and gruff demeanor. I leaned in slightly, trying not to seem too eager. "Who is she?" I asked, nodding toward the back door where the dancer had disappeared. The bartender gave me a long, hard look, his eyes narrowing. "Her name's Evelyn," he said, his voice low, almost as if he was telling me a secret. "She's been dancing here for as long as anyone can remember." I waited for him to elaborate, but he just gave me a curt nod and walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. Evelyn. There was something unsettling about the way he said her name, something that sent a chill down my spine. Over the next few weeks, I found myself returning to The Last Dance more often than I had expected. Every time I went, Evelyn was there, performing the same hauntingly beautiful dance. Sometimes the bar was nearly empty, and sometimes there were more people. But the effect she had on the room was always the same. She commanded attention, drawing every eye to her. But with each visit, I began to feel that something was wrong. At first, I couldn't quite place it, but it was there, creeping under the surface. The way the air grew colder when she danced, The way the other patrons seemed too still, too silent. It was like the world paused for her, and when she was finished, everything returned to normal, like a clock resetting itself. One evening after her performance, I caught a glimpse of her in the back room again. I waited until she was out of sight, then followed her, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to know more. I pushed open the door to the back room, hoping to find some clue, some explanation for the strange sensation I couldn't shake. The room was dimly lit, with old furniture stacked in the corners. A mirror on the far wall reflected the dim light, casting long shadows, and then there she was, Evelyn, standing perfectly still, staring at her reflection. "Evelyn?" I called softly, stepping into the room. She didn't respond, didn't even flinch. Her reflection, however, was not the same as her physical self. In the mirror, her eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to suck in all the light around them. Her smile was gone, replaced by an expression of emptiness that made my stomach twist. I wanted to turn away, but I couldn't. "You shouldn't be here," Evelyn's voice said, but her lips didn't move. It came from behind me, from the mirror itself. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one there. "Go back," the voice said, now a whisper in the cold air. I didn't wait to hear more. I ran back into the bar, my breath shallow, and I felt the eyes of everyone in the room on me. They were watching, but none of them spoke. Evelyn wasn't on the stage anymore, but the chill lingered. The next few days were a blur of restless sleep and uneasy thoughts. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, Evelyn's reflection, her hollow eyes, and that cold, otherworldly voice. I started asking around, hoping for some sort of explanation, but no one would tell me much. The regulars at the last dance were tight-lipped about her, and the bartender only muttered about her being just a dancer. But there was something more. There had to be. I went back one last time, hoping to find answers. The bar was quieter than usual, with only a handful of patrons nursing their drinks. I sat at the bar, waiting, my hands trembling slightly in my lap. When the music started, I looked toward the stage. Evelyn was there, dancing as usual. But this time, I noticed something different. Her eyes weren't just cold. They were empty, lifeless. As she danced, her movements were no longer graceful, but jerky, unnatural, like a puppet whose strings were pulled by something unseen. The room had grown unnervingly cold, and I saw the breath of the patrons around me fogging in the air. I could hear faint whispers again, coming from all directions. They grew louder, more frantic, until they became a chorus of voices, all calling out to me, urging me to leave. I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from her. And then, in a flash, the music stopped. Evelyn froze mid-step, her eyes locking onto mine. She was no longer the elegant dancer I had watched so many times. Now she was something else, something dark, something ancient. Her voice came again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream that echoed in my mind. "You shouldn't have followed me." Before I could react, the lights flickered and the air grew thick with an oppressive weight. The whispers became louder, and Evelyn disappeared, leaving only the lingering sense of something wrong. I never returned to the last dance. The bar closed a few months later and it was boarded up, left to decay like the rest of the district. But I've never forgotten the chilling presence of Evelyn, the bar dancer who never seemed to age, who moved through the world like a ghost. Sometimes when I pass by that corner on Elm Street, I swear I can hear the soft music playing just faintly in the distance, and I wonder if Evelyn is still dancing in the shadows, waiting for someone else to follow her. Story the end.